I'd love to welcome everybody today to a special hour with Robert Conway, class of '67, who will talk to us about civic architecture as an expression of national character, which I think at a time like the present is highly relevant. I'll call him Bob. I hope that's okay. That's how I've been talking
That's
to him the last
me. Yep.
few weeks. We'll discuss the roots of the public architecture in our democracy and the imperial monuments of ancient Rome and why it matters today. And maybe just briefly on Bob himself. He started out in Sage E at Williams his freshman year. Shout out to anybody from the Frosh Squad, myself included. He majored in English literature during his time, but actually he spent a fifth year at Williams taking classes at the Clark in art history. So the usual underachiever, as we all know, Williams students are. And he was a co-captain of the swimming team during his time at Williams, yet again, keeping busy. Since then, he's moved out to the Bay Area. He resides currently in Oakland, and he manages the estate of artists Bruce and Jean Connor for the Connor Family Trust. He has been an independent curator and art dealer in Oakland since 1991. And before that, he was director of 2 Manhattan galleries over on the East Coast. And lastly, during his career, Bob has produced numerous museum exhibitions and catalogs and multimedia educational programming. And aside from his degree from Williams, he also attended Princeton University. But we're delighted to have him today, Rick Ackerley, who together with me sits on the NorCal Alumni Association Executive Committee, had a great idea to invite Bob to speak to us about this topic. I believe the first time he did that was at the reunion, actually, 3 years ago on campus. So bringing back fond memories from that experience. And I'll step aside. I'm one of the 2 co-presidents. We love, obviously, organizing anything we can to create a sense of community, even during those difficult times. So even if it's virtual, I think it still matters than not having it. So please, any ideas, send them our way. We have another event tomorrow night with Bill Sawyers and Jay Ward, class of '84, that will talk about the California ballot and some of the main propositions that will be of interest to discuss. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Bob. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks very much, Vladimir. What I'm going to do is, first thing is turn off my video, so that I don't have to look at myself when I'm talking. Yes,
and I apologize on the housekeeping front to get that out of the way. So you can all, once Bob turns on the slides, you could select speaker view in the upper right. That way you could see the slides and Bob, but none of us. That's obviously personal preference, but we think that allows you to see the slides better. And then once we are done and we stop sharing the slide, we recommend again turning the general view where we see everybody and we can have a bit of a conversation with Q&A. In the meantime, for those familiar with Zoom, you know at the bottom you have the chat function. You could send us questions if you like, or you can hold off until the end, but we'll have the slides sort of continue for about 40 minutes so Bob can go through his remarks, and so we'll go through the questions at the end. Sorry, Bob, over to you again.
That's okay, thanks. Okay, can you all hear me, I hope?
We can hear you.
All right. Thanks everybody for coming. This is very heartening and gratifying to have such a large group, and particularly to see so many of my classmates. I miss all of you. This is the 5th iteration of a talk I first gave in June of 2017 at the class of '67's 50th reunion. John Huffnagel, who's sitting in today of our reunion committee, asked me to speak about art and society, an impossibly broad topic that gave me fits until I found myself channeling the voices of Professors Faison, Stoddard, Pearson, and Johnson each night just before falling asleep. I remembered moments from their lectures in Lawrence Hall, phrases and images that struck me back then and that I retained 50 years later. I decided to gather those together, filter them through some things I learned in graduate school, and build a talk around the result. It seemed to work for a forgiving reunion audience, although I think I wandered happily all over the place, covering too much material too quickly. Since then, I've narrowed the topic, each time adding some new content and dropping large amounts of the old until it felt reasonably focused and complete. Along the way, I tried to make a few specific improvements. The most important of these was to develop a critical framework based on a view of our national history that is larger and more well-informed than my own. The second was to make the general topic relevant to a specific time, place, and audience. In today's case, late October 2020, San Francisco and the NorCal Alumni Group. My current framework is derived from these two excellent books, both of which I highly recommend.
Oh, Bob, we might be not seeing your slides. I meant to mention.
You're not seeing the slides?
Please, anybody else, but I'm not seeing them. Rob, are you seeing them, Swan?
We're seeing the pumpkin.
Yeah, we
Oh,
see.
yeah.
I'm not. I'm seeing
Okay.
the Zoom meeting, not the slides. Sorry. So
Okay, hang on.
I didn't interrupt you because you were doing a great intro of it. I didn't want to.
Oh, here we go.
There you go. You
Got
didn't
it.
miss anything. This is the first real slide.
Okay. Oh, I've got my pumpkin icon on there. That's because I was born on Halloween. All right, here we go. In 2010, when Neil MacGregor was director of the British Museum, the BBC selected 100 objects from the museum's collection that covered human history from its beginnings to the present day, and then asked MacGregor and his curators to explain their relevance to the human experience. I'm taking the essence of MacGregor's approach, which he calls deciphering the messages which objects communicate across time, and applying it to historically important civic architecture in the United States to clarify what messages these public buildings from our nation's past say to us today. In particular, I'm interested in those messages that demonstrate what Jill Lepore, an historian at Harvard and writer for The New Yorker, summarizes in the conclusion to These Truths, her one-volume narrative of our country from 1492 to 2016. A nation born in contradiction, liberty in a land of slavery, sovereignty in a land of conquest will fight forever over the meaning of its history. I want to explain how and why important civic buildings manifest in their designs the contradictory nature of our founding, in hopes that understanding their messages will increase our awareness about ourselves and our nation. MacGregor's and Lepore's books are both comprehensive, while my presentation is brief. At the least, I hope that it alerts you to the joys of walking through our cities, taking a fresh look at public buildings we usually take for granted, and considering what they can tell us about our nation's past. Let's start with the familiar San Francisco landmark. For me, Coit Tower brings to mind three things: the view I get of it driving into the city from the Bay Bridge, the view I get from its plaza looking out at the bay, and the marvelous WPA murals inside it. The references in some of these murals to radical thought and action were coincident with the 1934 Maritimes workers' strike happening at the dockyards nearby, and consequently so controversial to the city's political and business establishment that the opening of the tower in July was canceled, its windows boarded up, and the murals inspected for any subversive content. In the end, only one mural explicitly showing the seal of the IWW was painted over. The rest, for example, Bernard Zackheim's library interior, which were more subtle in their politics, were left alone. On the right-hand side of the room, Zackheim painted his fellow muralists reading the newspaper headlines. Here, Benny Bufano reading about the commissioning of his own statue of St. Francis, and Ralph Stackpole about the destruction of Diego Rivera's mural in Rockefeller Center. Most prominently, John Langley Howard pulls Das Kapital from the bookshelf. Howard also painted a mural in the tower. Here, his grim depiction of California industrial scenes. On the left, a crowd of miners on strike, and on the right, two unemployed families camping downstream from a massive hydroelectric project. When we consider the interior of the tower in the context of its exterior, we discover a disparity between the economic and social crises that motivated these artists and the status and career of the architect who designed the tower containing their work. Starting with its first commission in 1909, the architectural firm of Bakewell and Brown built a highly successful practice, working for some of the Bay Area's most important institutions. Known for his richly decorated neoclassicism, which we'll get to in a minute, Arthur Brown also worked in other styles appropriate for his clients. For example, the Byzantine-influenced Temple Emmanuel in San Francisco and the Spanish Revival style that dominates the Stanford campus. A late work, Sproul Hall at UC Berkeley, is a rather tired example of what we call stripped-down classicism. Traditional classical forms like those on the front of his much earlier Berkeley City Hall, shorn of their ornament and simplified to their essence. Coit Tower is a much more successful example of his minimalist classicism. Although referring dismissively to the WPA mural project within, Brown said, "The primitive nature of Coit Tower would lend itself better to that sort of thing than other public buildings. One wonders what the city could have built if they'd given the project to an architect more sympathetic to the muralists and their cause." Jeffrey Tillman, author of a 2005 monograph on Brown, describes how the architect didn't know how to end his tower and cites the top of this late 15th century Gothic tower in Rouen as his source. If we look away the layers of high Gothic ornament, we can just see the series of elongated arches around an octagonal core that Brown borrowed to finish off his tower. There is, however, a more basic and more important source of Brown's design, the Doric columns of the Parthenon. Coit Tower is essentially a giant classically fluted column built from poured concrete drums stacked on top of each other, just as the ancient Greek columns are built from stacks of solid marble drums. Both share a grid of vertical flutes and horizontal seams. Throughout his career, Brown used Doric columns on many of his most important commissions in a full-blown neoclassical style. From his first major success, the San Francisco City Hall, to the massive complex in the Federal Triangle centering on the Mellon Auditorium, which was built at the same time as Coit Tower. His choice of this signature element of the ancient temple, the symbol of the golden age of Periclean Athens, and a beautiful yet deeply conservative form, at a time of great social, economic, and political disruption expressed by the murals inside, suggests what Jill Lepore would call a national contradiction, a discrepancy between the symbolic implications of neoclassical architecture and the actual circumstances in the United States in 1934, between the evocation of a distant past and the reality of the present. The story of how our civic architectural style came to embrace the buildings of ancient Greece and Rome can start with almost any municipal building in almost any city in the country. We'll start here in San Francisco with Brown's monumental City Hall. The new City Hall was intended to be the first and most important demonstration of San Francisco's rising from the ashes of the 1906 earthquake and fire. The previous City Hall was completed less than a decade earlier, but almost totally destroyed because of the use of substandard bricks in its constructions. Working within a pre-existing plan for the Civic Center, Brown based his design on that paradigm of American civic planning, Washington, D.C., and its most prominent building, the U.S. Capitol, a central colonnaded entrance flanked by matching lateral wings and topped by a massive dome. How better to proclaim the rebirth of the city than to evoke the birth of the nation? Construction of the Capitol ended in 1863 during Lincoln's administration, but the competition for its design opened in 1792 at the end of Washington's first term under the direction of then Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson. A brilliant polymath, Jefferson was an avid student of both architectural theory and practice. He worked closely with Pierre Charles L'Enfant, the classically trained French artist turned military engineer in the Continental Army, on the 1791 plan for the federal city. Since no buildings of the desired scale and importance yet existed in the United States, President Washington and Secretary Jefferson couldn't select an American architect on the basis of existing work. To avoid choosing someone from Britain or Europe, in the spring of 1792, they advertised a public competition for the design of both the President's House and the Capitol. First prize was $500 and second prize $250. That summer, George Washington selected James Holden's design for the President's House. But it's interesting to note that he didn't pick this drawing on the left, submitted anonymously by Jefferson. At the same time, Washington didn't find any of the 17 entries for the Capitol worthy of consideration, so the government invited new entries. One wonders how Jefferson felt about being rejected, but the more important question is whether his design had any influence on the eventual winning design for the Capitol submitted by Dr. William Thornton in February the following year. The similarities to Jefferson's proposal are obvious, especially when reinforced by his earlier design for his own home in Monticello. All three designs have the same combination of a classical temple front composed of a colonnade supporting a triangular pediment in front of a low, partially hemispherical dome. Both of Jefferson's designs come directly from illustration in Andrea Palladio's mid-century 16th century treatise, The Four Books of Architecture, a copy of which Jefferson had in his extensive library of architectural theory. But they are not based on the two buildings themselves, the Pantheon in Rome and the Villa Rotunda outside of Venice. Jefferson never saw either one, even though he traveled to northern Italy in 1787 when he was our ambassador to France. Both of Jefferson's designs come directly from illustrations, and we don't know why he didn't travel the short distance from east from Milan to Palladio's territory outside of Venice, or make the longer but certainly very rewarding journey south to Rome, but he didn't. And so his understanding of the two buildings that inspired him was necessarily intellectual rather than physical. He never felt what it's like to walk inside them. Why did Jefferson choose these as his models? The reason, as he states himself, is political. He saw the value of having the capital of a new nation evoke the models of antiquity. This strategy is not unique to him or to the United States or to the late 18th century. As we will see, 17 centuries earlier, it was the prime motive for the Roman emperor who commissioned the building Jefferson so admired. I doubt if the models of antiquity would have had the approbation of a radical like Thomas Paine, and I see contradiction between the form and content of Quaint Tower as parallel to that between Jefferson's preference for an antique capital and the stated principles of the government which would occupy it. Let's summarize our path so far. Working back from Arthur Brown's City Hall, completed just before the start of the First World War, to the final version of the US Capitol finished in the middle of the Civil War, to its original design submitted at the beginning of Washington's second term, to Jefferson Plantation Villa, begun the year before the Boston Tea Party, to an illustration from a mid-16th century treatise in his library, and then forward to his design of the main library at the University of Virginia, in the middle of the second term of James Monroe, our fifth president. The Uva Rotunda is Jefferson's most literal interpretation of the Pantheon, or more accurately, of Palladio's illustration of the Pantheon. He simplifies the facade by reducing the number of columns from 8 to 6, and increases their height so that he eliminates one of the Pantheon's two pediments. Doing so also requires compressing the two upper stories into one. Still, he keeps all of his modifications within the original overall proportions. Although what we might today call derivative, Jefferson's adaptation is skillfully done and results in a very handsome building, the focal point of his design of the university. Since Arthur Brown was educated at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, an entrenched defender of academic classicism, he would have known the significance of Palladio, the Pantheon, and Jefferson's University, and would have been comfortable with adopting a classical model to a contemporary commission. His choice for San Francisco made perfect sense. It would also make sense to the designers of 44 of our 50 state capitals. With the exceptions of Alaska and Hawaii, which came into the Union much later, the three towers in North Dakota, Nebraska, and Louisiana, and the Victorian Romanesque complex in New York, all our 19th century and early 20th century state capitals are restatements of the US Capitol, demonstrating that the influence of Jefferson's classical preferences was quick, continuous, and thorough. Let's now look at this lineage from the other end, from the source. The Pantheon is one of the great architectural marvels of the Western world. Radical design and innovative construction creating an unforgettable spatial and spiritual experience, all in the service of imperial succession. The facade gives no indication of anything revolutionary, rather the opposite, as a triangular pediment atop a colonnade has been the ubiquitous template of temple architecture for at least 5.5 centuries. It would be instantly recognizable to any citizen of Rome and anywhere else in the classical world as the way temples should look. Written across the entablature of this traditional facade is a clever bit of propaganda. If we fill in the ellipses and then translate from the Latin, we learn that according to the inscription, the Pantheon was built by Marcus Agrippa during his 3rd term as consul. However, Marcus Agrippa died 122 years before the construction of this building was started. He was the powerful and very successful deputy of Octavian, supporting him during the chaos after Julius Caesar's assassination, enabling him to become Augustus Caesar by defeating his main rivals for power, cleaning up the city's all-important water system, and sponsoring major building campaigns, making good the Augustan boast that, quote, "I found Rome a city of bricks and left it a city of marble." One of his buildings was a pantheon, a temple to all the gods, but it was only the first of 3 to be constructed on this site. What we see today was started by the Emperor Trajan and finished by his successor Hadrian. Both Trajan and Hadrian came from Roman Spain, so neither belonged to the Julio-Claudian succession that dominated the 1st century of imperial rule. Moreover, Trajan never formally named Hadrian as his successor, so becoming emperor in the atmosphere of political uncertainty following Trajan's death, Hadrian would benefit from a connection to Agrippa and by implication to Augustus and to the glorious origins of the Roman Empire that he aspired to lead. But this inscription is only the beginning. Whoever designed the Pantheon, and we believe it was a Syrian immigrant, understood what I'll call the architecture of theater, how to guide visitors through a dramatic spatial experience as they approach and then enter the building. The entrances of all 3 versions of the Pantheon line up directly across the park of the Campus Martius with the entrance to the Mausoleum Augusta, which was built right after Agrippa's crucial victory over Antony at Actium in 31 BC. Building an imperial burial site for yourself and your family at the beginning of your reign is a rather jaw-dropping expression of confidence and ambition on the part of the 32-year-old Augustus, a statement that was most likely not lost on both Trajan and Hadrian. To approach the current building, one had to enter through a gateway into the forecourt, along the main axis of the mausoleum at the other end of the Field of Mars. The level of the ground in front of the Pantheon was about 6 feet lower than it is today, so as one entered the forecourt, the top of the dome was blocked from view by the triangular temple pediment dominating the field of vision. The architecture channeled traffic to the front door while hiding what lay in store behind it. Once at the front steps, the visitor would now progress through 3 distinct sections of the building. The first is a forest of monumental columns, 16 solid pieces of Egyptian granite, 39 feet high and 5.5 feet in diameter. Moving through them is somewhat like walking through a grove of giant redwoods, with the sun casting alternate shafts of light and shadow. A massive set of doors, once flanked by Augustus and Agrippa, mark the beginning of the second section. A dense rectangular block of darkness without windows, a brief transition in our passage from the normality of the world outside to the mystery of the temple within. The cramped, slightly oppressive middle section opens to a dazzling interior of the dome, 143 feet in diameter, as high as it is wide, illuminated by a 30-foot wide oculus directly above. The first time I walked from the shadowy entry through the dark antechamber and into the vast space of the sanctuary, I became disoriented and a little dizzy, and had to move from its center to the perimeter so I could touch the wall and regain a manageable sense of scale. I believe the architect intended me to have this physical and emotional reaction, as if I just entered the dome of heaven, the realm of all the gods and the true pantheon. This movement into the center of the building, although theatrical in effect, is not the result of a series of superficial illusions. It is real, and the strength of our experience is grounded in simple but rigorous geometry. If you draw lines from the centers of the four niches on the diagonal axis of the interior, you get a perfect square that duplicates the area of the entrance. Converting this plan to 3 dimensions, we see that the domed interior consists of a perfect sphere within a perfect drum, while the 2 preliminary sections are likewise contained within a perfect cube. Although we aren't consciously aware of this geometry as we move through the spaces it defines, I believe that we experience it kinesthetically in our muscles and bones, if not in our conscious minds. The geometric rigor of the Pantheon has a metaphysical and political purpose. Like the pyramids of Egypt and Mesoamerica, the Pantheon is aligned with the apparent annual movement of the sun. Unlike the pyramids, however, the alignment here isn't with the solstices or the equinoxes. Instead, the sun's rays pass through the oculus and hit the front entrance on April 21st, 2 days before the vernal equinox. April 21st is, according to legend, the day that Romulus founded the city of Rome. Every year on this day, the emperor would enter the domed interior, bathed in Apollo's light, dramatically demonstrating his own claim to divinity and therefore to absolute rule. I haven't talked at all about how Hadrian's architect and crew built the Pantheon. There are many examples of the genius of their construction. I'll pick just 2. Both address the structural challenge of how to deal with the enormous pressure of the weight of the dome upon the supporting drum, and how to disguise this problem by creating an illusion of weightlessness. The first involves a network of relieving arches hidden in the fabric of the wall that direct the weight of the dome away from the empty spaces of the niches that ring the drum onto its thickest parts. The effect is nicely illustrated by this 19th century view of the interior, with the viewer standing inside the large arch at the rear of the main axis, looking across the vast space and out the front door. An interior full of light and air from floor to ceiling and up through the oculus to the sky above. The second concerns progression and mixtures of materials used to construct the dome and drum. Not only does the dome taper in thickness from springing to oculus from 23 feet down to 2 feet and then into thin air, but it is also made of much lighter materials. The lowest levels of the drum are made of travertine, an extremely durable type of limestone formed by the evaporation of minerals at the outlets of hot springs with twice the compressive strength of concrete. The Romans quarried in Tivoli, just outside Rome, also the site of Hadrian's vacation villa, but we are more likely to have seen it in Carlsbad Caverns or Yellowstone National Park. The Coliseum is the world's largest structure built of travertine. Tufa is rock made from highly compressed volcanic ash, strong yet lighter than travertine with a relatively soft surface, which allows it to be shaped easily. The monuments of Easter Island are carved from tufa. The Romans cut it into building stones, complete walls like this one in Pompeii. Scoria is another volcanic rock formed by magma trapping gases as it cools after an eruption. It's very light, only slightly heavier than pumice, which is so light that it floats. You can find it at any Home Depot garden center. Back in the 70s, it was the ubiquitous ground covering for Taco Bell franchises. These aggregates of mundane materials put to common sense uses have a cumulative result that we can measure by noting that the Pantheon is still today the largest unreinforced concrete dome standing, and that it took 13 centuries before anyone else in the Western world built anything comparable. The architect of this dome was another polymath, Filippo Brunelleschi, developer of linear perspective in drawing and painting, a goldsmith, sculptor, and architect primarily responsible for reviving the style of classical Rome that has dominated Western architecture from the early Renaissance straight through to the work of Arthur Brown during the Great Depression. His solution to building the dome of Il Duomo in Florence combines sophisticated geometry, generating an 8-sided and 2-layered tapered dome from a chord 4/5 of the length of a line connecting opposite pairs of vertices of an octagonal drum, and clever bricklaying, a herringbone pattern by which the vertical blocks in the pattern of each layer, once dry, supported the next wet layer until it dried, allowing the masons to advance up the arcs from the top of the drum without needing interior scaffolding. The next great advance in dome space, 150 years later, was the result of a progression of the best architects available in Italy over a span of 109 years. We see Brunelleschi's influence in the Ovoid Dome designed by Michelangelo and the other two of the Pantheon's 3 parts, the triangular temple front and transitional middle section, compressed by Carlo Maderno into a shallow facade and foyer so that the dominant portion of the floor takes the shape of a traditional Latin cross nave leading to the climax of the high altar beneath the gigantic dome. Michelangelo took on the building of the dome when he was 72 and died 17 years later, some years before it was completed. Just as his creative output dominated European painting and sculpture for the next 100 years or so, so his dome for St. Peter's established the model of churches ever since. For our purposes today, the 2 most important examples of this model are in London and Paris. Important because the 2 individuals so closely involved in the initial design of the Capitol, Thomas Jefferson and William Thornton, saw both buildings in person. And by the middle of the 19th century, when work on the Capitol was finally complete, the work of architects Wren and Mansart was well known in the United States, specifically in the firms of Charles Bulfinch, 3rd architect of the Capitol, and Benjamin Latrobe, 2nd architect and mentor to the 4th and final one, Thomas Walter. By the time Walter started on the Capitol Dome in 1855, the domed space of the Invalides in Paris had been repurposed as the site of Emperor Napoleon's tomb. This didn't deter Walter from closely following Mansart's 2-story dome design. Now we can construct a more complete line of influence, from an imperial Roman temple to the symbol of the Florentine Republic, to the center of Western Catholicism, to the seat of London's Anglican bishop, to Louis XIV's home for war veterans converted to Napoleon's mausoleum, to the US Capitol, to the San Francisco City Hall. When we add to this sequence the plantation at Monticello and the original design for the Capitol, the complicated provenance of City Hall in San Francisco is apparent. A mixture of patronage of the emperors Augustus, Hadrian, and Napoleon, Louis XIV, the Florentine Guild of World Merchants, 18 popes, and Thomas Jefferson. I think for most of us, this legacy is taken for granted. The neoclassical style has been our government's default choice for 2 centuries, and civic buildings that look like Roman or Greek temples are ubiquitous and unremarkable. There may be more pedimented temple fronts in use today in Washington, D.C. than in Athens and Rome combined. The symbols of power and authority in antiquity have been homogenized into a look that we accept without question, and on which we continue to bestow, as Jefferson said, the approbation of thousands of years. He was probably thinking about the Parthenon, the symbol of Athenian democracy, although the building he chose to elevate to national prominence was a symbol of the Roman Empire. And here are our updated versions of both. Unfortunately, if you blend these two together and inflate the results to a grotesque scale, you get something like the Volkshalle, the focal point of Hitler's vision of Berlin as the capital of the world. You might well be wondering whether any of this has real significance. The first time I entered the Pantheon, I knew almost nothing about its design, construction, or political patronage, and yet it was still one of the most moving architectural experiences I can remember. Or when any of us enter City Hall, does it detract from our experience of that beautiful and popular wedding site? If we don't know anything about Arthur Brown's sources, the imperial and Catholic heritage of our national civic style is not as obvious a contradiction of our stated principles as Jefferson's being both the principal author of the Declaration of Independence and a slaveholder. The issue here is more subtle, more a part of our civic background, an architectural normality that points to a philosophical glitch. How could Thomas Jefferson, such a progressive thinker and leader of the New World in the 18th century Enlightenment, so enthusiastically embrace the style of the old world of antiquity? However we answer the question, we won't be tearing down the Lincoln Memorial anytime soon. It is one of many handsome, memorable buildings, and besides, its exterior is unimportant compared with who works and what happens inside and around them. But it is worth considering our civic architecture as one of the many aspects of our national character, especially in times of chaos, when the need to know how things devolved to such an extreme state is so urgent. Clothing democratic institutions in autocratic styles may be another lead to follow in understanding how we got to where we are today. My argument here might benefit from offering a counterpoint, so I'll suggest another book to you, Susan Neiman's analysis of American history of racism through the filter of German anti-Semitism. Written in 2019, it is entirely relevant to what is happening right now. Her thesis is the antithesis of Thomas Jefferson's. Our civic monuments are not about invoking history, the approbation of thousands of years, but are about the predominant values of the time during which they are built, made visible in the forms and material with which they are built. With Neiman as a guide, we're leaving the neoclassical architecture of the past 3 centuries to look at public monuments built in the past 4 decades, to illustrate how architects discarded the trappings of an imperial style in favor of something not only more modern in appearance, but also more consonant with our current values. This is a drawing done by a Chinese-American grad student at Yale in 1981. It is so minimal, so spare, and so simple that we may not recognize it for its importance. But the concept behind this drawing changed the way America honors its dead. In 1979, the Vietnam Veterans Memorial Fund started raising private money for a memorial, not to the war they served in, and not to the government that had sent them, but to the veterans themselves. 2 years later, it opened a jury competition with 4 criteria. The design had to be reflective and contemplative in character. It had to harmonize with its surroundings. It had to display the names of all those killed, missing in action, or still prisoners of war. And it had to be free of political statement. More than 1,400 entries were submitted anonymously, and the jury unanimously selected the one submitted by Maya Lin. Even though Lin's wall is extremely minimal, the long, gradual descent toward its vertex is, for me, as powerful a spatial experience as walking into the Pantheon, as much a descent into the underworld as the other is an entry into heaven. Although veterans groups like the American Legion approved the winning design, the Reagan administration did not, and Secretary of the Interior James Watt refused to grant permission to build on government land unless the Memorial Fund compromised its decision and allowed the second place entry, a figurative bronze grouping of 3 soldiers, to be added. The fund successfully countered with the request that the soldiers be placed so that they looked toward the wall. This adjustment drew the statues into the wall's field of influence and established a workable compromise between competing agendas. At the time, I felt that the statues were a violation of Lynn's design. She, however, was more generous and farsighted, as artists often are. She said, "In a funny sense, the compromise brings the memorial closer to the truth. What is also memorialized is that people still cannot resolve the war." In her acknowledging the fight over how we remember the Vietnam War, Lynn is modeling what Susan Neiman meant when she said that we choose the values we want to pass on. By accepting the statues, Maya Lin demonstrated the inclusive, non-political statement of truth that her design invites us to share. The elements of Lynn's design, the reflective black marble, the density of the inscriptions, and the total lack of constraint upon visitors allow for private mourning in a public space. Lynn's wall doesn't glorify or otherwise influence our experience. She has invented a new vocabulary which quickly became the style of choice for public memorials. And here are a few notable examples, all following her combination of simple geometry, repetitive form, plain but elegant surfaces, and minimal text to bear witness to multiple catastrophes. Through the Lens of Faith opened July 1st, 2019, and closed September 30th of this year. To the familiar elements of plain surfaces and repetitive modular shapes, it adds video interviews with the last remaining survivors of the Auschwitz camp, 2 of whom died since the memorial was completed. Reacting against their parents' unwillingness to grapple with their recent history, the post-war generation of Germans began a concerted effort of Vergangenheitsaufarbeitung, working out the past. It's a wonderful compound word which came into use in the 1960s, the process of grappling with the crimes of one's past, admitting their continuing influence on the present, and taking action to keep that destructive legacy from polluting the future. A program active for the last 5 or 6 decades in Germany, very much like what we in America are just beginning. 2 examples of this process. The first began in Germany and spread worldwide over the last 25 years. And the second, a program started in Alabama in 2018. In form, or at least in size, these 2 programs couldn't be more different. Cobblestones about 4 inches on a side versus steel monoliths the size of coffins. But they are very much kindred spirits, both documenting atrocities, the Holocaust in Europe and the epidemic of lynching in the United States, in specific places committed against specific individuals, repeating this specificity over and over until the weight of the collective crimes is unavoidable, and more importantly, placing the reminders of history in the neighborhoods and communities where they were occurred, so that local citizens can transmute the horrors of the past into positive behavior in the present. The Stolpersteine are the creations of Gunter Demnig, a German artist born just after the war, whose first job out of art school in the late 70s was with a firm restoring monuments. He made and installed his first stone in 1996 and has since then placed over 75,000 across Europe. To quote from the project's website, Demnig has always been aware that it will never be possible to lay Stolpersteine for the millions of victims of the Nazis. Thus, his project remains symbolic rather than literal. Each Stolperstein is made and placed by hand. Michael Friedrichs Friedlander fabricates some 440 brass plates a month. Gunter Demnig travels across Germany and Europe and lays them in the sidewalk. or street directly opposite the dwelling places of the victims before they were deported. Here you can see Friedrich Friedlander embossing text on a plate in Demning on the site, installing a pair of stones. This is obviously a laborious process dependent on the dedication of a few people. But Demning has made a conscious decision to not expand production, in deliberate contrast to the industrial scale of mass murder that the Nazis engaged in between 1933 and 1945. Each stone has standard information beginning with hier wohnte, here lived, then the name of the person, birth date, deportation date, destination, and date of his or her murder. There's one stone for one person. Here are the stones in memory of the Berg family. The father Isaac and two of his daughters, Sala and Hella, were murdered somewhere in Poland. The mother Tauba and two more daughters, Pepi and Sabina, in the Krakow ghetto, and the oldest daughter, Silly, and her baby in Kolomea, a town in Western Ukraine occupied by the Nazis in 1941. We are free to respond as we please, our reactions ranging from reverence to indifference, or even to hostility and vandalism. While the Vietnam Veterans Wall, the memorials in Oklahoma City, New York, Berlin, and Auschwitz draw their power from concentrating their message in an elegant and eloquent setting, the Stumbling Stones project is a purposely decentralized, community-based project. The genius of the National Monument for Peace and Justice is its combination of both. A stunning installation on a hill just outside of downtown Montgomery, and provision for distributing replicas of its steel monoliths for the counties where the crimes it documents occurred. When one enters the memorial, the steel coffins hang just above the floor. As you work your way through this grid, the floor descends to a vertex, much like Maya Lin's wall, and soon the coffins hang above, like strange fruit hanging from southern trees. You can't avoid them, either as morbid obstacles or as the crushing weight of a history that our country has not yet fully acknowledged. Each coffin has embossed on its face the name of a county where lynchings occurred and the names of the victims and dates of their murders. When the coffins are too high to read, the county's names are inscribed on the bases. Brian Stevenson has given us a succinct and complete definition of the process of Vergangenheitsaufarbeiten: acknowledgement, redemption, restoration, and rehabilitation. His way of doing this is so simple yet so challenging. Laid in rows outside the memorial are duplicates of each coffin, which will lie in place like unclaimed gravestones or giant Stolpersteine until each of 805 counties claims theirs. This process of reclamation, if it gains momentum, would act as a very moving and positive response to the ongoing removal of Confederate monuments. Because we have so much history to own up to, at the same time that history is being made, seemingly more quickly than we can handle, getting satisfactory report cards will involve decades of very hard work. I'll end on a hopeful note by returning to Thomas Jefferson and his Pantheon-Inspired Library at UVA, which, like his home at Monticello and all of his design of the campus, was built by slaves. Starting in 2011, the university solicited input from student, faculty, and community, including descendants of slaves who built the school, sharing with them a half-dozen designs at the beginning of 2017 and finalizing the review by the middle of that same year. The finished monument honors the approximately 4,000 slaves who worked at the school between 1817 and 1865. Jefferson Rotunda was built in 1822. The university's statement of purpose is an eloquent and complete expression of Vergangenheitsaufarbeiten, working out the past. So I'll let it speak for itself. The interior surface of the ring lists the 578 slaves whose names are known, and another 311 who can be identified only by their role as a cook, gardener, or a servant, leaving about 3,000 memory marks, blank lines on the stone for the remaining unnamed. The exterior is carved with an enormous pair of eyes, those of Isabella Gibbons, a former enslaved cook for a UVA professor who became an educator after her emancipation in 1865, teaching at an African-American elementary school until her death in 1889. You'll recognize once again the influence of Maya Lin's Vietnam Memorial in this use of names, as well as the rigorous geometry, the placement within the landscape, the elegant textures and colors of the natural material. And in a nice bit of geometric working out the past, the architects decided that the perfect size for their ring was the diameter of Jefferson's dome. And I decided that this is the perfect place to stop.
Thanks, Bob.
You're welcome.
Um,
I'll get rid of my.
Better every time, Bob.
What'd you say, Rick?
I said it gets better every time.
Thanks.
I mean, I'd love to open it up. There wasn't anything that came in during the last 45 minutes while Bob was presenting, but open to any questions or comments. And then Bob, since you did it before, maybe there's something that's usually resonates with people if nobody steps forward that you want to sort of offer as a.
Let the record show that Bob left us speechless.
Well, a lot of people are muted, so
Yeah,
they can't talk.
Let me do that. I can fix that. We can just unmute. I think it's.
Hi, can you hear?
Yeah.
Yeah, you can hear me. This is Paul Stryker. Hi, Bob.
Hi, Paul.
And I apologize. I came in late, but if you look at today's email on class of 67, you'll understand why. And forgive me if you've already covered this, but I was wondering about the monuments in Richmond, Virginia now. And if you, I know you mentioned a little bit about the coffins at UVA as a response to that, but if you were, say, a city councilman in Richmond, how would you solve the problem of the Confederate statues and what to do with them?
Luckily, I'm not a city official, so I don't have to resolve it. But I suppose the proposal that I like the best that I've heard is that they take the monuments and put them into a designated space, maybe outside or inside in the museum, so that they're not destroyed. They can still be seen, and they can stand as object lessons about the past. That's an imperfect solution, but I can't think of a better one.
I had thought, and I don't know if it's a good idea or not, of replacing half those statues with new monuments taken from the other point of view, say from the point of view of the slaves, or others, all kinds of living enactments of what was going on in that period of America's history.
Yeah, I think, if you then get sort of competing monuments, pairs, one in a neoclassical style from about 100 years ago, and one in something contemporary, you're going to then stimulate kind of meaningless arguments about which is better, and does the second one respond adequately to the first, and so on and so forth. That's why I like the coffins from Montgomery. If they get out into the communities where the lynchings occurred, they will be different enough than the existing Confederate monuments to not invite a comparison, but similar enough or related closely enough to sort of indict the Confederate statues in a way that transcends words.
Okay.
Do you know how, if any, or how many of those have been reclaimed by the counties?
That's a really good question. I've searched all over the site for that project, And nowhere do they say, or do they have a census of what's still there and what's been moved out. And I've been checking that site for the last 6 or 8 months, and I can't find any record at all. And I hope that doesn't mean that they haven't sent any out, but I really don't know.
I was wondering if Maya Lin had any basis for what she came up with, or whether Maya Lin might be thought of as a new paradigm for these kinds of memorials, because she certainly does seem to have a lot of descendants.
Yeah, she doesn't have a predecessor. She was a grad student in Yale's architectural school, and she had an assignment to design a public memorial. And that's all she did, was that simple little drawing. It just came out of her head.
Huh.
And she really is the progenitor of a whole new style of monuments. By the way, Bob, it's nice to see you after all these years.
Yeah, I'm glad to see you again too. I was thinking about some of the times we spent together, you know, on a swim team, and I remember one time, I think it was at Vassar or some place there. Anyway, it was I was thinking a lot about you.
Yeah. Bob McCartney was a fantastic swimmer, much better swimmer than I was.
Well, I always enjoyed having Bob on the team, and we had good times together, that's for sure.
Yeah. More questions?
I
Yeah.
just had a comment about, I took with Professor Gruden an art history course on memorials, kind of specifically around the Holocaust,
Mhm.
and as a senior seminar. And I don't know, I could try to look back and see if she had some references or something, but if you, anybody who's interested in this, that was something that Professor Gruden talked a lot about, was sort of like the ways that you memorialize specific events like the Holocaust, and the Holocaust museums and different memorials not wanting to necessarily represent people's bodies for various reasons, and just like the complexities of that. And I think the Maya Lin was something we looked a lot at as a way to use objects or non-representational objects. And there's just a lot of really interesting history about that. So just made me think of sharing.
Thanks.
It
Hi
was.
there. Ooh, I'm sorry.
Go ahead, please. I was just going to note, it was brought to my attention that in 2 minutes, the archival committee is using the same Zoom account. What a wonderful kind of connection to our topic. But so I apologize, we have to wrap up in about a minute, but I know there was one more question here, and the recording will be made available. I know there was a couple of questions on that.
Oh,
So.
good.
Bob, can you hear me? This is Don Brown.
Hey, Donnie, how are you?
I'm fine. It's a good while since I've seen you.
Another swimmer.
Yes, much less so than your fabulous backstroke. Brian Stevenson is a friend and a colleague, and a client. I'm an architect, have been for a number of years, and had something to do with the memorial, which is an incredible building and quite a reflective asset. Brian's a great guy. I'll ask him and get you back the numbers.
Oh, that'd be great. Thanks.
I'm not sure I know how to send you something, but we'll.
Oh, I'm on the alumni email list.
I'll get you, and I'll do that near term.
Thanks very much, Don. Good to see you.
Yeah, I apologize. I think maybe Elise had a question. She raised her hand. Maybe we could squeeze it quickly in, or if not, yeah, okay, go ahead.
Hi there. Thanks so much. I'm actually Williams class of '88, and I teach at George Washington University. So I'm on the other coast. I'm just a little interloper. And I'm actually writing a book called Classical Washington, Greece and Rome in the Art and Architecture of DC. And that was a stunning talk you gave. Thank you so much. And incredible slides. And I just, I would love to connect with you and chat at some point, but very briefly, people might want to check out The Culture of Classicism by Caroline Winterer, who's a faculty member at Stanford. It's a fabulous study that explains why Jefferson and all of his descendants well into the 19th and early 20th century might be interested in these classical forms. I'm just writing a piece about the US Treasury, which I saw in one of your slides, for example, and the east facade of that, which is along 15th Street, is the first long colonnade to be built in the United States. And he was extremely cognizant of that and really fought a long and hard battle to have that building built in that fashion. And it's based directly on the Ionic colonnade from the Erechtheion on the Athenian Acropolis, just opposite, just north of the Parthenon, and also on the Temple of Artemis at Ephesus, which is one of the earliest Ionic buildings from the western coast of Turkey, which is called Ionia, which is thought, not entirely correctly, to be the source of the Ionic order. So anyway, there's a lot behind all of this, and it's has to do with our founding fathers having been steeped, obviously, in classical education and in their constant desire to make the United States compete on what was then the world stage, obviously, but really the European stage, right? We needed our own versions of these great buildings that you so gorgeously lined up. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Lise. I can't wait to read your book.
Don't hold your breath.
Thanks, everybody. I'm sorry I have to cut this off, but it was really wonderful. Thank you, Vladimir and Bob. Thanks so much. It really was
Great to see all my classmates. Good to see you all.
Thank you all for coming.
Thank you very much.
Outstanding. Thank you.
You're welcome.